you so much for tuning in to Monarch Magazine's virtual series, Architects for Change. I am Bianca Charday, and I am the lifestyle editor for Monarch Magazine, and I'm so excited to have a powerful dialogue with the writers and producers of the two-part docuseries, And She Could Be Next. This amazing docuseries explores politics through the lens of African American women who have been transforming communities, movements, and American politics from the ground up. All right. Thank you so much, ladies, for tuning into and joining me for Monarchs Magazine recap of this amazing film. I want you to tell your listeners a little bit about yourself and how you got involved with this film.
Josie, why don't you start?
Okay, great. So I actually transitioned out of a career in studio marketing. And as I did that, I became involved with this documentary about the equal rights movement. And one of the things I noticed as I was working on that project is how that movement stalled, and with it, it seemed to slow or at least plateau the uptake of women in politics. Mm-hmm. And I've always been fascinated with systemic change and how that moves. So when Hillary's candidacy started to rise, and it was clear she was going to be the Democratic nominee, it seemed like an interesting time to examine women in politics. And of course, I'm not a seasoned documentary filmmaker like my two partners here, who are quite, established in their fields. So one of the things I did in researching was actually I watched a movie that Grace Lee made. It was a historical take on women in politics, and there was a young Rashida Tlaib embedded in that. And so many of my friends had said, if you want to take on this kind of a project, you should talk to Grace Lee. So luckily enough, I was able to connect with her. And as we headed into the historic 2016 election cycle, we started this project. But of course, we had no idea that, what the outcome was going to be. So clearly we had to pivot afterwards, ...
Grace?
Yeah, sure. So, I've always been interested in politics, but politicians not so much. And as Jyoti said, I made this other film several years ago about kind of the long, slow fight for equality of women in Congress. It was more like a PBS historical type film. And for the first time, I actually met Rashida Tlaib, who was then a state representative in Michigan, representing Detroit. And I was taken by the fact that this woman who felt sort of like a friend, she's someone like I could relate to. She was young, she was the daughter of immigrants, she's from the Midwest, she has a mom of young kids, really rooted in her community, felt like somebody who I'd never seen before in politics. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. And because a lot of my work always sort of, is rooted in stories about communities of color, immigrants, women, these kinds of themes have sort of percolated throughout my filmmaking career. And when Jyoti approached me, we thought, okay, what's it going to be like in 2016 when we have our first woman president? That didn't happen. But at the same time, these movements that have been led by women of color have been happening, for generations. And it just seemed like a great moment to dig into, the changing demographics of this country, what we call the new American majority, and sort of looking at who is coming up the pike, who's next, who's going to be representing, who's going to actually reflect this country, the lived experiences, the democracy that we purport to be. And that's when we thought, okay, let's make a film about women of color transforming politics. And to do that, we need a team of women of color filmmakers. And that's when I, needed another filmmaker to come on board. And that's when I called Marge to join us. And then we started again.
I absolutely love
like
it.
A three-part story, yeah.
So Marge, tell us about yourself as well, and how did you get involved with this project?
Well, I was plastered to my couch, like holding my head in my hands, wondering what is happening in the world. When Grace called and she was like, hey, do you want to do a project about women of color transforming American politics? And it just felt like, it felt like exactly the kind of balm I needed to reinstill some hope in me. And also a way to fight back, or a way through story and character, which is, the tools that we use, to sort of go beyond headlines and look at, some of these kind of really deep issues in our country that were keeping us up at night. And what does that look like on the ground, you know? So I've been an immigrant, an outsider my whole life. I'm from Iran. I filed for U.S. citizenship after 20 years of living here, the day after candidate Trump announced his total and complete ban on Muslims. It was very personal to me. And so it was both an intersection of sort of me needing something that I could believe in again, and a real understanding that this is not a story that America is talking about now. Now we're talking about it 3 years later, but we weren't talking about it then, but we knew that this was the story, you know? So it kind of was a no-brainer to get going.
Which brings me to the title, and she could be next. I absolutely love it. I think it's very fitting. And so collectively, Grace, Jyoti, Marge, how did you come up with that title? That title in itself is absolutely amazing, by the way. But it kind of leaves you lingering.
I'm going to take that one. Like, actually, my husband suggested the title. And again, this was in the light of the 2016 election cycle, where we had a different premise, but it seems to fit moving forward. And frankly, I would say we never found another one. I'd be honest about it.
Titles are hard.
It's okay. It happens. You know, I think life itself, it's full circle. You know, what you put into the universe returns it as well. So even if it is an idea, maybe it wasn't the right time for it to return itself and for it to come to fruition, but it's back and it's absolutely amazing. So, so next is, how did this project come together? So, you know, we have Ava DuVernay, it's her EP series, and we have the three of you, absolutely amazing women. This is a powerhouse of women, by the way. Like, you guys are going to knock down doors, knock down cements, knock down the world. You're going to mop the entire ocean floor with this series. I'm super excited. Like, I had, of course, a chance to look at it, and I literally watched it 4 times, and it has inspired me as well as an activist and someone who works heavy in advocacy. So how did this project come together, and how did it, you know, come to fruition and come full force?
Through the traditional methods of blood, sweat, and tears. You know, it's a very heavy lift. Making documentary is a very heavy lift. Walking into pitch a show where in our industry, so many of the gatekeepers are not women of color.
No, they're not.
Over and over in rooms trying to explain why a story about women of color by women of color was going to be interesting to people. You know, we heard it was reinforced for us why this project was important. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, we're used to the general slog. Unfortunately, when you put a whole team of brown girls together, the ambition level goes through the roof. So Absolutely. we weren't here to play, right? We weren't looking to do something sort of small.
There is no room. There is no room.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that having a whole team of people who, you know, we all experience this kind of walking in the world this way together really kind of spurred us on, you know. So we just weren't going to take no for an answer, and we weren't going to give up. So you know, luckily there are some great funders and supporters who came in early and believed in us immediately, which allowed us to get the ball rolling. I think Grace mentioned earlier, we really wanted, in our industry too, representation was a problem. Mm-hmm. And we're very aware that the documentary form, you know, defines communities, defines types of people for an audience. And in our business, usually when there's a documentary that starts and ends, all the frames include people of color and women of color. It's Absolutely. Very often like a saving film, you know, mm-hmm. someone needs saving. Mm-hmm. And we didn't want to do that, you know. Mm-hmm. So we built this extraordinary team of colleagues and other amazing all-star documentary filmmakers who are all women of color. And, you know, we just went to it.
Anybody else want to chime in and echo more of these sentiments?
Sure. I would add that also finding the people to follow was also, it's a whole other, you know, kind of not quite casting process, but a long research process, sort of exploring who are the women that we want to follow, right? We had an extensive research process. You know, we we knew that we wanted to document a movement, and we didn't want to just make a campaign or election film, because that sort of, runs its course at the end of the election. We really wanted to explore this moment in history where, this defining moment in our country's demographics and politics, and it's happening right now. We see it outside our window every day. We wanted to explore this particular moment. So we had to find the right people who not only, sort of matched kind of our thesis, sort of looking at women who are rooted in community, women who are, who didn't wake up after 2016 election and decide that they needed to do something. These are women who are already active in their communities, organizing, whether it's in labor or, voting rights, gun violence in the case of Lucy McBath. These women, running for office for them was really just an extension of what they were already doing. It was just sort of the next level, the next step. So finding those people, and also, making sure that these were people who were comfortable with the documentary crew following them was another step too. So
this leads me to my next. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that actually was a long process, as different candidates started to emerge after Trump's election, or after the 2016 election. And one of the things that's really exciting is not only did we cover a lot of geography, but we also were able to cover the issues of the day, whether it was Islamophobia or immigration or gun laws, all through the lens of these women who are rooted in their own communities, and of whom, these issues are absolutely critical to those communities.
I thoroughly enjoyed watching it. I think it embodied and it touched on all the isms of our society, all the isms that you could think of that we go through on the regular, even including the microaggressions and implicit biases that we go through as a culture, and primarily as women. Jesus, there's a plethora and there's so many layers of them. So this leads me to my next question. How did you choose your main characters for the film?
So we went through this research process. We sort of started to narrow it down. It's tricky because it's not like there's a list that's published on a certain day of all the people who are going to run. So you just kind of have to track a little bit. We had some tenets. So we knew we wanted a diversity ethnically, geographically. We wanted young and old. And we also wanted to make sure that we were looking at women who were running for all kinds of seats, right, at every level. I think that one of the sort of pieces of education that we need to sort of engage in as Americans is that it's not just tuning into a presidential top of the ticket thing, right? Like that's important, but much more important is what's happening at the local level, because those people make the decisions in your life. And so we knew we wanted that. So we had these kind of tenets. We knew Stacey Abrams' race was going to be historic and just such an incredible candidate. So we knew we wanted Stacey. We found Bushra, the young girl from Skokie, Illinois, who just instantly fell head over heels for her. She's just so fantastic. And then Rashida didn't actually. Well, Grace, why don't you talk about when we managed to bring Rashida in?
Yeah,
so that's absolutely fabulous, by the way.
Yeah, so I knew Rashida because she was in this previous film that I made several years ago, and I always thought, wow, if she ever runs for something else, something bigger than state rep, and actually she wasn't even running at that time, she was just an interview talking head. I thought that would be cool to follow. And so in the beginning, I was like, are you going to run for anything? She's like, nope. But then, and she was recommending other people, but then this seat came up, John Conyers, the legendary John Conyers, congressman of, the Detroit's 13th district for 50 some years, left his seat, and all of a sudden she decided to run. So that happened, and so, in many ways that was very serendipitous, because she's someone who I knew was an amazing character and had a lot to offer in terms of, something we've never seen before in terms of politics. And yeah, so that was, a very important get for the project. And then who else? Veronica Escobar and Maria Elena Durazo.
Yeah, Maria Elena, actually, I'm also involved in a local organization here called LANE, or Los Angeles Alliance for a New Economy. And Maria Elena is a local hero. She's been organizing in labor forever. And she also decided for the first time to jump from organizing work. I mean, she was meant to actually transition into, being a grandmother. But I think this moment called to her. And so she also decided to announce a candidacy for state senate in California. So that was one way we got to bring in a different level of politics, the state level, which is also
absolutely. So my next question, it's a beautiful thing, and it's also extremely inspiring to see women from different races, ethnic backgrounds collaborating to tell their stories. What do the three of you believe is different about the world when viewed through the eyes of women of color? And, we can start with anyone.
I'm always starting because I talk a lot.
That's okay. You're saying something, though.
We walk through the world carrying all these multiple identities, right? We don't have the choice to put down the multiple identities, which means that by default, the way that we see the world and we experience the world, has sort of shades of understanding to it.
Yes,
women of color have been leading movement and change forever. I think that what's so powerful about the women who are in our film, and that includes the organizers, is that they really have the shared lived experience with this sort of changed America. When we look at leadership, we can't have a country that looks like our country looks now, the face of America, and have leadership that's majority white and male. It's just not a fit, right? So it just sort of fell at the nexus. Women of color fell at the nexus of so many important stories. Plus, we need to celebrate these women, right? Like I always think, we're so good in America of heroizing people, and we should heroize these women because they're really their work is extraordinary, and they're so brilliant and strategic and smart and sassy and funny and tireless. And why not center that? Why not center race and gender kind of unapologetically? Because unfortunately, when you look in America at outcomes in health and education and any sort of aspects of American life, when you intersect race and gender, you get really poor outcomes. So we have these extraordinary women, but they're also living at the intersection of things not working right for people.
Correct.
So it just seemed like a really natural fit.
Absolutely. It's very organic, extremely.
Well, as one of the women in our film said, when you solve for problems that women of color, I'm paraphrasing, that women of color encounter, you solve for all problems. So,
absolutely. I think, with issues with women of color, I think that women, regardless of their ethnic background, can identify with some of the issues because at the end of the day, we're all women. We're all women. We're all women. Did you want to chime in, Grace?
Yeah, sure. I mean, one of the reasons I make films is exactly what you said. I mean, my entire life, born and raised here, I haven't seen realities reflected back to me that reflect what I know. Even though I was born and raised in the Midwest, raised by immigrant parents, and now I live in the middle of Koreatown, Los Angeles, in a city that's, majority Asian and Latino. That's not what reflected back to me in the media, in the stories that I care about. So part of my motivation as a filmmaker is to tell the stories that I want to see. I see a different reality, and it's, certainly not reflected back in my government, or in media, and that's kind of a correction, right? And it's part of, I guess, our life's work. It's, I'm not running for public office, but my work is in storytelling and correcting it that way, right? I mean, it's about the record, the public record of how we lived and who we were and what this country, who this country is made up of, and it's not reflected.
It's not all consistent either. Let's say that. So besides being women of color, what is the common thread that connects all three of you?
We're badasses. We're
I love it.
We're unwilling to settle. We live in LA. I just think we're all politically motivated, right?
And we just want the world to be better, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the themes of our impact campaign is there's an organizer in all of us, and all three of
Absolutely.
us, we are organized in different ways in our own lives, whether it's in the documentary field, whether it's doing stuff with our kids or our schools, stuff like that. I mean, everyone can relate to be an organizer, even if they're not running for office or formally doing something, with a political party. I think that's something that, women of color have been doing this, they have been the backbone of social movements in this country for generations. And that's something I think that the three of us also, kind of carry together.
Absolutely love it. So being women of color, have you experienced support or a misunderstanding from white female counterparts? And how was that experience and how did you handle it?
Girl,
Oh,
ask, the questions.
Did you give me the old girl?
I did.
Let me get comfortable then. Let me change my position on this one. Let's get comfortable.
Yeah.
Let me get comfortable.
I mean, one doesn't want to generalize, but
Right.
there is, especially after the 2016 election and the amazing kind of engagement that happened from women across the country and the Women's March and all of that, right? We often heard, isn't this just a smaller story about the much larger women's movement?
Absolutely.
An erasure of the importance of race and of
Absolutely.
the work of women of color in that paradigm, right?
And it's also hidden as feminism sometimes.
Yeah, totally. And there is an idea of kind of we all have this experience as women, but it's not the same. It is not the same if you are a white woman as if you are not a white woman. And so, listen, I think we're in a moment of kind of national unblinkering. A lot of people are being asked to look inward and to sort of take off some of their blinders. And I think this is one of them. And learning that, centering women of color it's not a bad idea to be quiet and listen and let women of color speak and lead for a minute. Was definitely so yeah, I mean, that said, we also have some fantastic white women who have funded us, who've supported us. Our executive producer is an incredibly progressive ally at POV who, went to the mat to make sure that this show was picked up. So, you can't generalize. But let's just say, as Oprah says, there you go, I'm going to put it in the words of Oprah, right? White women have some work to do in this larger paradigm too.
Especially for that paradigm to be shifted and permanently shifted, more importantly. Anyone else want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I would just add, like, having the film come out in this particular moment with COVID, with all of the uprisings that are happening right now. I mean, there's reckoning happening in so many different fields, including our own field of documentary, which is very interesting. Like I often wonder to some of the comments that we got in the, development pre-production process, Marge, some of the comments we received from some people, I think they'd probably be walking them back right now, and I think it's about time. I mean, I think it's one of the reasons we really leaned into centering race and gender, because how can you talk about politics in this country in this moment without doing both, right? It is really problematic if you don't talk about both in this moment. And to the point about, we're all women. I mean, we're women of color, but there's also differences. I mean, we're not Black women either, and we're not Native American. We have our own experiences, which other people, are also, we're so uneducated about all of our different experiences. And one of the goals of this project is to sort of, I think there's a lot of people who are invested in this new American majority and how we can come together and start understanding the differences, but also the similarities so that we can move forward.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that, as I was alluding to earlier, that when I was studying, if you will, the movement to pass the Equal Rights Amendment, I think a lot of women, and it was driven by white women, and they were puzzled at some point about the bifurcation of that movement. And I think if there was more of a sense of shared understanding, and building a coalition building that might have turned out differently. And I think those same women are finding themselves needing to educate themselves. I mean, they're completely well-meaning. It's almost unconscious bias, really, but not understanding that there's a whole other set of pain out there that just doesn't surround them. And I think a lot of those women, to their credit, are doing the hard work to really try to now understand this moment. So none of us want to, cast any shade on that, obviously. I mean, we all need to do the work to understand others.
And kudos to the three of you for even just creating, such an amazing series, especially at this time where we're going through more than one pandemic. We have COVID, but we're also dealing with, the George Floyd issues and the constant lynching of African Americans, and dealing with racism. So I do think, the time is now. And even the title, I appreciate the title because, and she could be next, because that kind of leaves an open-ending feeling, an open-ended level of energy for the next female who is going to come and be in your shoes afterwards. So I appreciate that. And I think often as women, I encounter the mean girls. I know you guys encounter the mean girls. And, it's like, well, if you know that I'm younger than you and you see that I have the same ambition and fire that you have, why not embrace me? Because, if you are, and I say this, and I say this often, I believe in giving props to people who have paved the way for me, who have opened the doors for me, who have knocked down those doors, or even built doors for me that were not even there. But oftentimes we have women who don't embrace us. Who don't say, hey, well, let me teach you a little bit more. Let me help you cultivate those skills. Let me introduce you to someone who could help you further your movement. So I appreciate this. And I also, like I said, I really appreciate the title. The title is very, 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 it helps you center. It promotes unity. And I think it's amazing. So next is, what would you like to achieve with this project? And how would you consider it a success?
Someone else should start. I can't start.
All right. Let me start that one. I mean, we, like Marge said, we have big ambition, right? We're not shy about that. So one of the tenets being there's an organizer in all of us. Our goal is literally to use this as a tool to help anyone who's out there organizing, from individual to big organization, to basically join together and make sure that that power of the new American majority really is realized. Everyone needs to be connected in some way to a political home, so that because politics is unbelievably complicated and made so on purpose. So you need trusted allies to kind of help smooth the way, so that you don't have to do all the work all the time. And so that's what we've learned in talking to the organizers in our project, that's the way you do it. You stay connected, you work as a team, as a squad, if you will. And that's how you get over that finish line.
That's amazing. That is absolutely amazing. Grace?
Yeah, I mean, what you said, find a political home. I think also in this moment, lean in, step into your own power, like what we talked about, being, there's an organizer in all of us, not all of us are going to run for office. Don't recommend it for everybody, but you might want to lean into some kind of campaign, whether that's around a candidate or around an issue. Maybe it's dealing with like some kind of environmental issue in your neighborhood, something like that. Whatever, kind of engages you in this moment, whether it's defunding the police, or maybe it's, making sure that, schools are meeting the needs of, public schools are meeting the needs of their students. I think wherever your interest is, I think there's a way to plug in, and that's, the only way we're going to participate in democracy is we actually participate, and that's how we're going to make our voices heard. So, finding a political home, specifically with And She Could Be Next, you saw both episodes. The second episode deals with voter suppression, which is going to be a huge issue. Already is a huge issue, as we see yesterday in Kentucky. What are we going to do about that? There are forces that are intentionally trying to stop us from making our voice be heard. We want people to be able to find a political home and, counter that, because this is, too many people fought too hard for us to have our voice as our vote.
Absolutely. And there has to be some level of accountability as well on our part, some type of contingency plan. There has to be some type of contingency plan, some type of clear, concise agenda. We can, as I would say, even, let's even speak of protests. We can raise all the hell that we want, but what exactly are we asking for? What are we demanding? And I have a question based on what you and Josie just said. It says finding your political voice. Tell me about that process. How does someone find their political voice, and what exactly does that mean? And tell our viewers about that.
Well, we were saying two things, really. One is finding a political home in the sense of if you work with a group, then it makes the path easier, right? And so we are actually working very hard to put some resources even up on our own website to help guide people who get inspired by our series. But then secondly, it's that idea of stepping into your power. Everyone has so the idea of finding your political voice, meaning whatever the issue is that motivates you, and there are so many, then step into your power and speak up, right? I mean, look at all those people that you saw in the course of the series. They were ordinary people who organized and made themselves up. Yeah.
I think it's also about civic engagement, right? Like re-embracing the importance of civic engagement. And part of that is kind of doing the work to educate yourself. What are the tools of power? How does stuff go from someone's idea into legislation? Who represents you in your city council, in your local county commission? Where are those meetings happening? Right now, all those meetings are happening on Zoom, so they're super easy to access, right? What happens in the city council meeting? What does the agenda look like? How does the parliamentary process work? I know it's dull. I mean, it is dull, but because it's dull, so many of us are tapping out. And when we tap out, the decisions are made in the room that we're not in.
Absolutely.
Right? So I think that part of it is just like as an exploration, as a thing of curiosity, make a commitment that you'll find 3 local government meetings that you'll show up for. And you don't have to speak the first time. You can observe and learn. But you start to see how the machinery works. I've done a little bit of work on the local government level here in Los Angeles where I live. And I know that my city council people have told me when, 50 people call our office about something, like it's a big deal. It's the first agenda on the staff meeting. If 200 people call us, we drop everything and we're dealing with it. 200 people is not a lot of people, right? So the ability to use, and we've got, social media, we have ways to connect with each other. As Grace said, you organize anyway in your mom group or your whatever group. Like, we have to claim our power. And no one's just going to come and hand it to us, right? So we see voting as sort of a floor to civic engagement, but really understanding and knowing what is happening around you and where can you say your bit. I was just part of a 4-hour meeting the other night. There was one of the local councils was, there's a proposal for the Los Angeles Police Department to not get the $150 million increase that they were due to get in this year's budget. And the mayor of LA, Eric Garcetti, has made this proposal, and local councils are weighing in. And I tell you, when that 4-hour meeting started, the board who were going to make that vote were leaning in the way of saying, we disagree with this. You should not defund. By the end of that 4-hour meeting, it passed the other way. They rejected sending that letter saying you should not defund. And it happened because a bunch of people showed up and sat through that meeting and just talked about their experience and how that sat with them. So, we have to give the input for leadership to then know who they're representing and what we actually think. And then it's incumbent upon them to pass that forward with their power.
Which leads me to my next question, and I think this is, my favorite question of this entire interview. And we can start with you, Marge. What does change look like for you?
Oof. There's a well-known phrase that has been playing through my mind fairly consistently since the 2016 election in America, which is that when you're accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression. And
Absolutely.
I think it really sort of, it really kind of summarizes this moment that we're in. So for me, change looks like a more level playing field with a rebalancing of the system of power within any ecosystem, whether that's governmental or, in our case, sort of in the documentary industry, whatever your thing is. There has, and in order for that ecosystem to rebalance, some people need to get some more of what they don't have, and some people need to give up some of what they have and make some space. And I think that I feel like the moment of uprising we've been in this country has opened a real viable window for people to rethink the kind of norms that they participate in without understanding how those norms are oppressive to one set of people, So for me, change looks like a collective vision where we all say, it's not good enough. I'm not free until you're free. I'm not, empowered until you're empowered. If we actually all did that at the individual level, I feel like change would come pretty quickly,
Absolutely.
But it requires a flipping of the script and a real willingness to do the hard work, which is like, I'm going to give up some of my pie for you. And, we've been conditioned to try to get as much pie as we can, right? So it's like a reprogramming of how you walk in the world.
Right. And more importantly, what you said, it's working together. If I'm not free unless you're free. And it reminds me of this adage, and it's a Southern adage that my grandmother tells me often. And I come from a family in which they believe in the power of handwritten notes. So I still get handwritten thank you notes. My grandmother, still sends me handwritten cards of encouragement. And she sent me one recently, and it says, if you want to go fast, you go alone. But if you want to go far, you go with someone else. And more importantly, someone else that you trust. So Grace, this question is for you as well. What does change look like?
I think Marge said it really well. But one thing that I've been thinking about lately, somebody, mentors have said to me is change comes when you actually are able to look inward and look at yourself.
Absolutely.
And sort of, figure out how are you part of the problem as well. I think there's a lot of reflection happening, I hope, amongst people right now, because as I said, this is a time of reckoning. For me, it's like you have to change yourself first in order to change the world. Like that needs to come internally first before you can make the step and like convince other people to do it, or to sort of come along. So for me, it always comes back to, self-reflection and, understanding like what are the pathways to change.
Jyoti, this question is for you.
Both Marge and Grace have been incredibly eloquent on this topic, but I think the only thing I would add is the idea of really those out there who have, for whatever reason, felt like they were not heard, were not seen. If there's any opportunity for those as they're getting connected to their political home and to a larger group, this coalition that's building, if they actively now start to speak up, because we say this often in our own meetings that democracy is a participatory sport, right? So everyone has to get off the sidelines. Yeah. And so whatever your old reasoning was, now is the time to put that aside and just, step forward.
And it's time to move forward. So I know that oftentimes, even within activism and advocacy, although we're the leaders, we're the one, feeding into other people, we're teaching, but oftentimes we learn a lot ourselves. So what did each of you take away from this project individually?
So many, so many things. I'm trying to think of one resonant one.
Well, one that kind of
really,
jarred you emotionally.
I'll tell you what jarred me emotionally was being in Georgia through the apocalyptic voter suppression that happened in 2018. I mean, to see what that looks like on the ground, to see what it looks like for someone to take time off work in a job where they don't get paid when they're not clocking in, right? And stand in a line for 6 hours in the rain that day, right? And to make all this sacrifice for your constitutional right to vote, and then find out that vote was, stolen, is horrifying. And I think that many of us have the privilege of living in places where that doesn't actually happen that often. It's not a thing. And so to see it up close, not like read it in the news, but what does it look like to actually have this incredibly important right taken from you? And what does it look like to fight for that vote, to get it counted, was so humbling for me. I mean, it really helped me understand, like that's a problem for all of us to solve. That's not just a problem if you're in Kentucky or if you're in Georgia or wherever you may be, right? Like it comes back to I can't be free until you can't be free, right? Like if we actually claim as a country to be the poster child for democracy, then our democracy must function. And this is a problem for all of us to solve, because power doesn't like to be ceded. And so as numbers and demographics shift, one of the ways for power to be held onto is cheating. And that's the thing that we all are going to, be going through between now and the next election and the one after and the one after. So we all have a collective responsibility. I'll never forget when Black South Africans got the right to vote. I was
absolutely.
And I remember those photographs, this like snaking lines for miles. People had walked for miles to exercise this profoundly important right. And we can't be here in this country going to war in other countries in the name of democracy and allow our own to be so fragile. So we have to be the foot soldiers of democracy, right? We have to be the guard of protecting our democracy. And that's work for all of us to do, whether it takes you 5 minutes to go vote in your neighborhood or it takes somebody else 8 hours to go vote in there.
Absolutely beautiful. Grace, what did you take from this project personally?
Yeah, many things, but I would just say, like, when we talk about our impact campaign, making civic engagement a lifestyle, yeah, I vote every election. It's been pounded into me since I was, my parents were immigrants, but they voted in every election, and I voted, but I didn't really think about it. I just kind of voted, and I didn't really understand like how powerful that was. But now I understand that voting is really just the floor, like when people are being denied like the right to vote, like what we've been seeing during this pandemic, especially, even though it's been happening in other places before. I mean, that is unacceptable. I can't sit still and see that, it's easy for me to vote in my neighborhood, but it's not easy for these other folks to vote. It's heartbreaking, coming out in the middle of a pandemic with one polling place open for 200,000 people is
Absolutely.
a crime. I mean, it is terrible, right? And we can't just sit by and like let that, what Marge has been saying, like that is unfair, and it is not what this democracy is about, right? Like we have to get engaged and make sure that people are being able to exercise this right, because it's too precious, right? It's so tied up in so many things. And if that means there's an organizer in all of us, and we're going to organize, make sure that the communities closest to us are able to, have their voice, then that's what I'm going to do. It's not just going to be about voting.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Jyoti.
Well, I mean, clearly both Grace and Marge have said it so well. I mean, the actual details of what voter suppression looks like, the personal experience of that versus something you see reported is absolutely, it changes everything. It changes your perspective. But not to repeat what they've said, the other side of it is, the other thing that really struck me and is that, when we talk about civic engagement, it sounds a little bit like eating your, or taking your vitamins, right? But if you watch this, people are having fun. I mean, there is so much joy out there. And I know I myself have been having, in many ways, as I'm outraged by the state of our country and our world, I'm also connected to people in a brand new way, in a really deeply profound way, because we're all talking about our values and we're living our values. And so when we say live a civically engaged life, this means have fun, do it with joy, like as Oprah might say, live your best life. That's all possible as you go out there and you fight for what you want this country to look like.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So the next question, and you guys you've mentioned this more than one time, and this might be wink, wink, your next title to your next series. If we're going to go ahead and put it out there in the atmosphere. There's an organizer in all of us. There's an organizer in all of us. So from each of you, what advice would you provide to aspiring activists or whomever who sees themselves as a change agent of the world, or someone who works heavy in advocacy? What advice would you provide to them?
Hydrate. Wear sunscreen if you're out. And,
listen, I'm just coming from a protest. Right before this interview, I'm just coming from a protest.
I don't know how you
joke.
look like how you look and just came from a protest. But if you can look like that while you protest, then more props to you. Listen, I think if you're starting out, start local. Literally, wherever you live, get on the internet, promise yourself to do this for half an hour. Get online, figure out who actually represents me at city level, county level, state level. Like, who are the people? Print out their phone numbers, stick it on your wall. Sign up for their emails, follow them on your social media. I will say that oftentimes our elected officials try very hard to communicate with us, and we find it boring. We're only tuning in every now and then, right?
Right. So, it's redundant a little bit. Yeah, mundane.
Yeah, exactly. So it is hard. I mean, I've been on the other side of that, and it's really hard to get people to plug in and like pay attention. So just start there. And then when you hear or see something happening in your city that you're not happy with, pick up the phone and call someone and tell them. They never get calls. So develop relationships with these people. And like everything in life, when you have a relationship, then you have power. And so I think that if we just kind of start there, you see pretty quickly that you actually do have power and influence and agency. I know it feels daunting to some people, but it really isn't that daunting if you just get yourself in motion. So I think that's my sort of simplest bit of advice is start in your hometown and just start small, and it'll build from there.
Grace.
Yeah, I took your question geared more toward people who are already active.
Or aspiring activists. We talked within this interview about finding your political voice and finding your political place, and just kind of finding your place of whatever that is going to be. If you know that you're called to be a change agent, you know that you're called to be in some level of advocacy and activism, what advice would you give someone?
I think when you're starting out, listen to the people who are already active, so you don't just come in and sort of become the person who needs to do something.
Correct.
Honestly, there's probably people who have been doing this way longer than you have and have a history and an experience and understand nuances that you may not, and they're not reinventing the wheel, right? So I would say listen, and also pause. I think so many people are angry, and there's emotions are running high, and you want to get out there and do something. But, it's also important that action is super important, but it's also important to reflect and, sort of really dig through what are we actually asking for? What is the end game? What do we want to accomplish here? Right. And I think that's best done, not shouting, but like in conversation and really, connecting with people and understanding what is the common goal, what are the shared values that we have.
Correct. Jyoti, what advice would you give?
I'd build on that, because it's the idea that you've got something you're concerned about. If you go out and you find those like-minded people, not only are you going to be in conversation and you're going to learn a little bit about what's already happening, who's doing the work already, but you're also going to have a team. You're going to be part of a group,
Right.
and it's going to be way more enjoyable. And
Mhm.
if you at first don't find that those like-minded people, keep looking. They're there. They're out there. And
Absolutely.
absolutely, there is nobody covering the issue that you feel is critically important, then, start your own thing. But chances are there's somebody out there that has thought the same thing that you're thinking. And
Absolutely.
yeah.
So, Marge, I have a question for you, and you made me think about this question. You talked about whoever the activist, because the activist, you're still a constituent. At the end of the day, you're still a constituent, and you said that the activist or the aspiring activist or the advocate or whomever is the change agent, that they should research who their elected officials are in that area, whatever the issue is that they're concerned about or that's pressing to them, research that in legislation. Now, on the flip side, I think, from someone who has, sat on both sides, what advice would you give someone who is an elected official and someone who is in a position to write bills, introduce policies, and how would they be able to connect to an aspiring activist or help them get their voice and get that mission, get that policy introduced? What advice would you give that elected official? Because that's important too. I think oftentimes
Absolutely, yeah.
many don't know how to bridge that gap between that elected official and that constituent. And I think sometimes, and I'll say this as someone who is an activist, I think there are a number of times that elected officials are completely disconnected to their constituents. I think they know the issues on a surface level. They don't get the chance to really, really dive into the socio-emotional and socio-economical issues within that area of their constituents. So what advice would you give someone who is an elected official, and how do they connect with activists, or give them the floor, give them the ground to speak, to get their voices heard?
I mean, it's what Grace said, right? It's about listening. It's learning to listen, but it's also being brave enough to listen, because, most often, I believe, an elected official hears from you when you're pissed off about something, right?
Absolutely.
Like, you're not calling to be like, gee, my trash was picked up so well today. Thank you for that. They don't get to hear that. But I actually think it's important, like if something good, if your local person does something good, it's a good idea to drop them a note and say, hey, cops. I remember when this, actually, it was actually at the end of Obama's time, there was a House resolution, which was kind of the foundations actually for the Muslim ban. And my representative, Karen Bass in Congress, who's the head of the Black Caucus, was one of, I think it was like 9 or 14 votes against all other 435, who didn't have the courage to vote. And for me, that courage was really meaningful. And I called her office and I said, hey, I'm your constituent. Thank you, So we have one person who represents us. They represent hundreds of us or thousands of us, right? So it's not exactly fair, but I think we have to pick up the labor to but I mean, literally call their office and say, when may I, is there a town hall coming up? Is it possible for me to come and meet with my field deputy? I want to talk about some things in the neighborhood. We have to disrupt the system a little bit, right? And the system kind of coasts along as it does. And the whole point of this moment is a collective disruption to say that coasting along isn't really working. I don't know if you remember, right at the beginning after the election, there were all these fantastic, like, engaged groups who would go, like 15 women would show up to their council member's office.
Absolutely.
I mean, there was something really exciting and inspiring about that moment, but it is tiring to do and to sustain. I think sustaining is something that's really hard as an organizer.
Sustainability,
right?
and consistency.
Exhausting. Yeah, exactly. So at the end of the day, these are people too. They are human beings. And if we can make a human-to-human connection with our electeds and they see us, then they are going to start to care about what we are bringing to them. So I think we have to take the effort on our side. And then if they're not listening, that's when you've got your vote.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So before we wrap up this interview, I want to dive into some personal questions. And we'll start with you, Grace. So we know that you're from the Midwest, and I believe you're a first-generation American. How did this film affect you and shape your outlook on the world?
Uh, it's interesting. I mean, I've made a lot of films over the last 20 years, and I feel like a lot of what I've been doing has been leading up to this particular project.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because, growing up in the middle of Missouri, the child of immigrants, as I said before, I didn't really see myself or my community reflected back in media, government in any form. And I think that shaped the kinds of films that I would make for the rest of my career, whether they were about Asian Americans, immigrants, women, um, people in the Midwest, right? And I think, this project really combines like what's really important to me, both personally and politically, and politics is very important to me politically.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's very personal, like, I mean, I think it's also, we joke that, I mean, for me personally, like this working on this project and being around all the organizers, all of the candidates, these movements what has sustained me for the last like 2 or 3 years. It's kind of given me like some kind of hope. It's actually, whenever I sort of look around and think about, oh my God, what is happening to this country and what path are we going down right now? But then I see people in the trenches still fighting the fight, and also like going, running for office in really difficult situations, trying to raise money you know, um, that gives me hope. It actually inspires me to want to keep going as well. And I realize that my lane is storytelling, and that this is my contribution, right? So I don't know if that's changed me, but it's definitely sustained me through this time.
Well, no, sustainability is important. That I
Mhm.
mean that's extremely important. Jyoti, once you completed the editing, and was this experience emotional? And did you take anything away from this amazing project?
Everything has been absolutely an emotional roller coaster ride from the moment we began this project, to be
Uh-huh.
honest. And I will say I am not somebody who normally lives that way, but it's just an unprecedented time, right? So there's so many individual sort of light bulb moments, and especially on an emotional level. One of the things that really resonated, and I think I want to build off of what Grace was saying.
Mm-hmm.
There's an organizer that we highlight in particular. Her name is Ense Ufot, and
Mm-hmm.
she, throughout the process of covering her, has been very clear that she does not organize election to election. And I
Mm-hmm.
realized that I think election to election. It was one
Absolutely.
election that sort of initiated this, and we were gearing towards another election.
Mm-hmm.
And to change my mindset, I mean, this is big. And so many of my friends are very geared towards this election that's coming up. But I can
Mm-hmm.
tell you that the organizers out there are thinking way beyond that. They have this, they focus on the long part of the arc of justice, right?
Mm-hmm.
And for me, that's a very emotional kind of pivot, because it sort of, you have to reset. It's like, well, this won't be over after November 3rd,
Absolutely.
right?
Absolutely
This is
not.
about changing your entire outlook forward. So anyway, that's my bit of insight on the end, or where we are now in this process anyway.
All right. And Marge, what motivated you to come to America and become so involved to change community relations in America?
I came to America because I heard about this thing called the American Dream, where anything was possible, and you could be who you wanted to be if you worked hard. And I really did. That's why I came. I really believed in all those things that we are told about the potential of this country. And actually, I think we all still believe in the potential of this country.
Absolutely.
Right? That is what we're fighting for, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I came like many immigrants come. I had previously immigrated from Iran to the United Kingdom, and then I came here, because there was better opportunity for work here. But why did I get involved? I mean, listen, as someone I feel like I've been an outsider my whole life. From the age of 7, I haven't lived among my people, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
My mother tongue, any of those things. And you can choose to be an outsider. If you find yourself outside of the system, you can choose to remain outside of that system, and many people do choose that. Or you can choose, to understand, how do I use what I have to sort of educate within the system, So I didn't ever really think of myself as a political person, but I am a person who has a very clear sense of justice and what is right and what is wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And we all have a responsibility to create a more just world. So politics is one avenue, but as Grace said, I use storytelling, I use advocacy. So it's just do what you can. And we all have a set of tools and talents and blessings and relationships. Use them for good. That's, and that's, in this moment, this seems like the best use of my talents.
This has been absolutely amazing. Grace, Jyoti, and Marge, I appreciate you guys so much for joining here at Monarch Magazine. I am the lifestyle editor, Bianca Charday. And before we leave, I would like for you to give our viewers your social media accounts. How do we stay in the loop of what each and every one of you have going on consistently?
Fantastic. So the easiest way is to go to our website, which is andsheCouldBeNext.com. And you'll find the social links there. But essentially, we are at And She Could Be Next everywhere except for Twitter, where we are just She Could Be Next. And I really do encourage people to follow, because in the next month or two after we broadcast, this is going to be up for free streaming. And we just have a host of incredible conversations and panels and events, all focused on centering organizers and women of color. And if you're looking for inspiration while you're locked into your house as COVID takes hold again, it's a really good place to get a lift. So we hope that people will follow us, and we hope that as we broadcast Monday and Tuesday of next week, that help us make some noise online and get your friends involved too.
Thank you so much, ladies, for joining us, and viewers. I am Bianca Charday. I'm your lifestyle editor for Monarch Magazine, and we've had an amazing dialogue with these three dynamic, absolutely dynamic, amazing women. So give yourselves a round of applause.
Thank you.
I gotta hear it.
It's been lovely. Really
Thank you so much.
You're the
Thank
best.
you so much. And She Could Be Next. That's the perfect title for this. Thank you for tuning in to the recap of And She Could Be Next. And once again, check us out on monarchmagazine.com, and please follow us on Instagram and Facebook, Monarch Magazine. Thank you so much, and we will talk to you soon.